Redwater Gulch never pretended to be a kind town. It was a place hammered together by gamblers, drifters, dust storms, and the kind of men who carried trouble on their hips and lies on their tongues. Yet on this particular night, as the desert wind moaned against the warped wooden buildings and lanterns flickered like dying stars, something heavier pressed over the saloon. A hush beneath the noise, a weight beneath the laughter. Folks wouldn't understand it until much later, but the night carried an omen. Somewhere in the dark, fate was walking toward them, bootstep by bootstep. Inside the broken lantern saloon, whiskey sloshed, boots stomped, and voices rose with false bravado. A piano clanked out a tune nobody listened to, and cigarette smoke spiraled toward a ceiling stained with years of sweat and regret. Cards slapped against tables, coins clinked, a few drunken cowboys argued over cattle prices, but all that sound felt like window dressing, noise hiding the fact that something in the air waited to break. The door creaked open, and everything changed. Elias Crow stepped inside the saloon with the slow, uneven gait of a man whose bones carried old stories. He looked like he'd ridden 50 miles without stopping and buried 50 years of sorrow before that. His coat was faded to a tired gray, the sort of color the desert sun bleached 1,000 times. His shoulders were narrow, his beard untrimmed, and his hands, when the lantern light struck them, trembled softly as if remembering a winter that never ended. Most men wouldn't have bothered turning to look at an old stranger like him. But Redwater Gulch wasn't full of decent men tonight. It was full of wolves pretending to be card players. A snicker rose from the far poker table. "That him?" someone whispered, nudging another with an elbow. "No, can't be. That one's half dead already." Elias didn't answer the laughter. He didn't look around. He just walked toward the counter, the limp in his right leg dragging slightly, whispering against the floorboards. He ordered a coffee, not whiskey, and that alone was enough to make a few mockers cough out fresh laughter. But Elias didn't flinch. His eyes drifted across the room, lingering on the poker table where 4 men sat with the smug confidence of rattlesnakes warming on a rock. Ridge Mullen, Gator Hob, Silas Kane, Red Jack, men whose names drew curses in 5 counties, men who smiled at other people's fear. Elias approached the table quietly. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Ridge Mullen leaned back with a grin so wide you could see where 2 teeth were missing. "Well now," Ridge drawled, "did someone's grandpa wander in looking for a warm fire and a place to nap?" More laughter. Harder this time. The dealer swallowed, his hands pausing above the deck, eyes flickering toward Elias with the wary instinct of a man who'd seen too many gunfights start this way. Elias set his cup down gently. "I'm here for a hand," he murmured. Gator Hob slapped the table. "A hand? You ain't got one steady enough to hold cards." Silas Kane leaned forward, eyes cold and sharp. "We ain't running a charity table, old-timer." Red Jack chewed a toothpick, sizing Elias up. "Let him sit. Maybe he'll pay for our drinks before he keels over." The mocking voices washed over Elias like wind over stone. He didn't react. Didn't lift his gaze. He simply eased himself into the empty chair, his movements slow, careful, as though each bone negotiated its own position. "Buy-in's not cheap," Ridge said. "You sure you ain't got a daughter to pawn or a horse to sell instead?" "I've got what I need," Elias replied. His voice wasn't shaky. It wasn't worn. It was steady, quiet as a church bell behind snow, but steady. The dealer hesitated, then dealt the cards. Elias held them without trembling now. The shaking stopped the moment the cards touched his fingers. Nobody noticed, yet. The first few rounds were easy enough. Elias folded quickly, surrendered small bets, lost pennies here, nickels there. His face never shifted. He drank his coffee. He listened to the outlaws howl with delight as they pocketed his coins. The saloon leaned in closer with each loss, the gamblers growing louder, the insults sharper. "Fossil. Relic. Should have stayed in your grave. Hey, old man, you playing cards or looking for where you buried your memory?" Ridge nudged Gator. "Shoot, he ain't even worth robbing. Man's half broke already." Elias said nothing. His fingers tapped the cards softly, rhythmically, like he was counting heartbeats or years. The dealer kept glancing at him, uneasy. There was something off about the old man, something too still, too quiet. Meanwhile, the pot grew. Round after round, it rose like a tide. Coins spilling over the edge of the table, notes added, watches tossed in, a silver belt buckle placed atop the pile. Folks gathered behind the outlaws, jeering, drinking, enjoying the slow humiliation. Only one person wasn't smiling, the woman at the end of the bar. Mara Ellison. Widow. Ranch woman. Quiet as dawn. Her glass stopped halfway to her lips when she caught sight of Elias. Her eyes widened, not in recognition of a stranger, but of a memory. The color drained from her face. Her hands tightened around the rim of her drink. Because she knew that limp. Knew that coat. Knew the way he held pain like a secret kept too long. And she knew the name that once followed him like a campfire legend. The pot climbed higher. Elias put in his last coin. Ridge sniffed the air as if smelling victory. Ah, look. The grandpa's out of pennies. Might have to start betting his boots. The table roared with laughter. Elias lifted his eyes slowly, like a man rising from a deep grave. He studied each outlaw in turn. Ridge's crooked grin. Gator's missing ear. Silas's scar down the cheek. Red Jack's twitchy fingers. His gaze softened, not with pity but with something heavier. Sorrow carved by years of hiding. Cards were dealt again. The dealer's fingers shook now. Elias stared at his hand, then laid it face down, untouched. I fold, he whispered. Ridge snorted. Course you do. But the way Elias set the cards down, gentle, deliberate, sent a ripple through the table. Gator cocked his head. Silas narrowed his eyes. Old man's acting strange, Silas muttered. He's acting broke, Ridge laughed. Ain't nothing strange about that. Yet the tension thickened. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, listening. Another round. Another loss. Elias's empty pockets hung like shadows, but still he played. Still he remained at the table, as if waiting for something only he could see. Red Jack leaned in close. What are you doing here, anyway? Trying to die in public. Elias didn't answer. Ridge threw an arm back dramatically. Hear that? Man's run clean out of words. Maybe we should. But Ridge's sentence halted abruptly as Mara Ellison stood from the bar, her face pale as desert moonlight. She took a step forward, eyes fixed on Elias with a dread that squeezed breath from her chest. The outlaws didn't notice her. Nobody but the bartender did. But she saw something the others were blind to. And Elias felt her gaze like a trembling prayer carried on the wind. The final round of the night began. Elias's hand trembled again, this time not from age, but restraint. The outlaws laughed louder, drunk on cruelty. Cards flew, bets were thrown in, coins clattered like dying breaths. The pot reached a size that could buy half the town. Ridge grinned with wolfish delight. All in. Gator slammed his hand down. All in. Silas followed. Red Jack matched them. All eyes turned to Elias. A hush like death fell. The old man pushed the last of his worthless chips forward. No, Ridge mocked. Say it loud. Say the words. Say you're all in. Elias lifted his face fully for the first time, and everything in the saloon stilled. His eyes were no longer tired, no longer lost. They were sharp, cold, ancient. A storm kept behind shutters for years. I'm all in, he said quietly. Mara whispered a broken breath, because in that moment, she wasn't looking at an old stranger. Long before Elias Crow became a hollow figure drifting through frontier towns, he had been a husband with laughter in his throat and a father with hope in his eyes. His ranch sat on a quiet stretch near Coldwater Ridge, a place where dawn spilled gold over the fields and nights hummed with coyotes in peace. His wife, Clara, baked bread that filled the porch with warm, sweet air. His son, little Jonah, chased chickens with a wooden rifle too big for his tiny hands, shouting that he would grow up to be just like his pa, the best shot in the territory. Back then Elias wasn't a ghost. He was a man who believed that a home could tame a wandering spirit, that love could quiet the echo of old battles and old scars. He trained horses, fixed fences, and carried Jonah on his shoulders to watch the sunrise over their land. Every morning, Clara teased him about his serious face, saying he looked like a man preparing for trouble even when he was only drinking coffee. Elias always answered the same way, by pulling her close, resting his forehead against hers, and whispering, "Trouble don't come where love stands watch." He believed it, until the night trouble came in a way no man could stand against. It began with distant hoofs. Elias remembered the sound even now, the pounding rhythm of death riding toward him. A gang of men, four silhouettes against the moon, rode up without warning, torches blazing like demons descending from the ridge. They shouted slurred curses, demanded money he didn't owe, and accused him of harboring a fugitive he'd never met. Elias tried to reason with them. Clara pulled Jonah close behind her. But cruelty doesn't listen. One of the riders, broad-shouldered, laughing, threw the first torch onto the porch roof. Fire raced across the beams like a hungry beast. Clara screamed. Jonah cried. Elias lunged forward to fight, but the butt of a rifle cracked across his temple and darkness swallowed him whole. When he woke, the world had already died. The house was ash. The barn collapsed. Clara's hand, her gentle, laughing hand, was blackened and still beneath fallen timber. Jonah's toy rifle lay broken near the well. Elias reached for it and fell to his knees, a howl tearing from his chest so raw and broken the desert itself seemed to recoil. He should have died beside them. He expected to. But something colder took root inside him instead. A quiet. A silence sharper than a blade. He buried them himself, Clara under the cottonwood, Jonah under the ridge's shadow, and disappeared. Some said he left west forever. Others whispered he hunted the men responsible. But truth was far darker. Elias buried not just his family, but his name, his purpose, his heart. Whatever he had been before turned to dust with the ashes of his home. Years later, no one recognized him in the saloon. Only one pair of eyes still carried enough memory to tremble at the sight of him. Mara Ellison slipped out of the Broken Lantern saloon the moment Elias muttered those quiet words over the poker table. The night air slapped her cheeks cold as she hurried around the corner, skirts brushing the dirt, breath fogging in the dark. She found the sheriff leaning against a post, boots crossed, half asleep, thinking the evening would pass without trouble. "Sheriff," she whispered sharply. He looked up. "Mara, what's wrong?" Her voice shook. "The mun at Ridge Mullen's table, that's no drifter. That's Elias Crow." The sheriff blinked slowly, confusion wrinkling his brow. "Crow? Mara, that man in there looks like a scarecrow someone forgot to burn. Elias Crow was a legend 20 years ago. Fastest gun west of the divide. This fellow can barely lift his coffee." "I know what I saw." Her voice lowered. "And you didn't hear the way he spoke. He wasn't shaking then. His eyes, they were sharp, like someone remembering how to breathe fire." The sheriff snorted. "Even if it was him, he's no threat. Ridge and his boys are mean as snakes, but they ain't stupid enough to shoot an unarmed old coot in a saloon." Mara grabbed his sleeve. "You don't understand. Those men, Ridge, Gator, Silas, Red Jack, they're the same ones who burned his ranch. They're the reason Clara and Jonah are gone." A long breath left the sheriff as the weight of that truth settled in. "No," he said softly. "If that's Crow, and those are the men who wronged him, then tonight ain't gonna end quiet." Inside, the outlaws were too busy gloating over the swollen pot to notice the world shifting beneath their boots. Ridge had drunk enough whiskey to loosen his tongue, but not enough to cloud his cruelty. He leaned back, boots on the table, pointing a finger at Elias like he was poking a corpse to see if it still twitched. "You know," Ridge drawled, "this whole table reminds me of a night years back. Some no-name rancher tried standing against the four of us. Thought he could buy us off with pride and a shovel. Fool got burned. Literally." Gator cackled. "Left him dead as smoke." Silas tapped his scar. Heard the wife's screams halfway down the ridge. Red Jack chuckled. "Kid too. No family left to tell the tale." The dealer froze, his face draining. A few spectators shifted uncomfortably. Only Elias remained motionless, except for his hand tightening around the rim of his empty cup. Ridge slapped the table. "Hell, old man, you remind me of him. Same tired eyes. Same useless stance. Bet he limped too after we taught him a lesson." Gator snorted. "Left him to burn." Elias finally raised his gaze. It was slow, steady, and so deliberate that every man at the table fell silent as if a noose tightened around their voices. When he looked at Ridge, the outlaw's grin faltered. When he looked at Gator, the big man's fingers twitched near his holster. Silas swallowed hard. Red Jack blinked, confused but uneasy. Those eyes weren't old. They were forged in fire. They were the eyes of a man who had seen his world die and somehow kept walking. The dealer whispered hoarsely, "Sweet Lord, it's him." Ridge stiffened. "Who?" But before anyone could answer, thunder cracked across the desert sky, loud, violent, echoing through the saloon like a warning cannon. The lanterns flickered. The piano player stopped mid-note. A gust of wind slammed the shutters, making them rattle like bones in a grave. Elias didn't flinch. He leaned forward, voice soft as a funeral prayer. "I didn't come to win your money." A cold silence spread through the room, slow and merciless. Ridge's breath hitched. Gator's hand twitched near his belt. Silas wiped sweat from his brow. Red Jack shifted in his seat, feeling the walls close in. Outside, more thunder rolled, a storm gathering over Redwater Gulch, thick and heavy like fate settling its accounts. Inside, the storm brewing was worse, because the men they thought was broken was rising, inch by inch, with the weight of the past behind him and the fire of vengeance returning to his blood. And as the wind howled through the gaps in the saloon walls, carrying dust, danger, and the scent of buried memories, everyone in the room felt it. The silence around Elias Crow was over, and the reckoning was just beginning. The cards for the final hand slid across the table with a whisper sharp enough to cut the tension hanging in the air. Ridge Mullen's grin widened as he tucked an extra ace up his sleeve with movements so sloppy even a blind ranch mule could have noticed. Gator Hobb nudged the deck with his elbow to force a clumsy shuffle that placed high cards exactly where he wanted them. Silas Kane tapped his boots 3 times, their silent signal, while Red Jack distracted the dealer with loud, obnoxious laughter. They weren't just cheating. They were flaunting it. Elias Crow watched them without expression. His last remaining coin, a dull gold piece with a scratch across its face, sat by his fingertips. It was the final remnant of a life he'd left buried under ash and memory. He pushed it into the pot with quiet dignity, his face unreadable, his hand steady despite the storm forming around him. Ridge threw his cards down triumphantly. Full house, boys. Read 'em and weak. Gator howled with laughter. Silas slammed the table. Red Jack shouted, "The old fossil's white clean." The whole saloon erupted. Elias didn't look at the cards. He didn't need to. He knew the deck had been stacked from the moment he sat down. He knew losing was never the point. Slowly, he placed his cards face down, untouched. "Well now," Ridge mocked, leaning back. "Look at you. Broke, beaten, bent. If I were you, old man, I'd crawl right back to the grave I came from." The laughter swelled as Elias rose from his chair. He moved slowly, each bone unfolding like a long-forgotten weapon being unlatched piece by piece. The outlaws laughed harder, drunk on their own cruelty, but the sound felt wrong, thin, nervous, echoing strangely against the walls. Elias stood straight, taller, straighter. His eyes lifted, and the bar fell into an uneasy hush. "You boys," he began quietly, "killed the wrong family." The laughter died mid-breath. Mara Ellison choked on a gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth. The sheriff, halfway through the saloon doors, froze as though struck by a wind colder than winter. Ridge's grin melted. "What did you say?" Elias didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Recognition struck the room like lightning, traveling from face to face, first in whispers, then in a rising murmur as every memory, every story, every half-forgotten rumor sharpened into truth. Elias reached for his coat. With deliberate calm, he peeled it off his shoulders and let it fall across the back of his chair. The faded fabric slipped away, revealing what he'd hidden for years. A leather holster, weathered but intact. A carved eagle etched across the strap. Wings spread, talons ready. The symbol wasn't decorative. It was a warning. Crow of Coldwater Ridge. A name spoken like myth. A sharpshooter whose skill blurred into legend long before he vanished. A moon believed dead, buried, or worse, forgotten. Silas staggered back. No, that can't." Gator's face drained white. Red Jack fumbled for his flask, hands trembling. Ridge's voice cracked. "We burned your place. We." Elias stepped forward. The movement was gentle, but the room felt it like thunder underfoot. "You murdered Clara," he said simply. "And Jonah." The storm outside roared as though the sky itself answered. For a moment, no one moved. The world held its breath. The lanterns flickered, shadows twitching along the saloon walls like restless ghosts. Then Ridge reached for his gun. It happened in a heartbeat and yet stretched into eternity. Ridge's fingers twitched toward his holster. Elias moved. The sound was barely a whisper, cloth shifting, boot turning, leather brushing against his leg. His hand swept down smoother than falling sand, swifter than rattler strike. His gun cleared the holster in a blur of polished metal and controlled fury. Before Ridge even touched his weapon, Elias's barrel rested against the outlaw's wrist. A single sharp motion disarmed him, sending Ridge's gun skittering across the floor. Gasps erupted. Silas went for his knife, but Elias pivoted with the grace of a memory awakened. The butt of his gun knocked Silas's hand aside, the blade clattering harmlessly away. Red Jack tried to stand. Elias grabbed him by the collar and slammed him back into his seat, not forcefully enough to harm, but enough to remind him that resistance was pointless. Gator swung a fist, big and clumsy. Elias sidestepped. Gator crashed into the table, sending coins flying like sparks from an anvil. Elias drove his knee into Gator's gut, not violence, but precision, just enough to knock the air out of him without breaking anything. Each movement was clean, exact, controlled. No blood. No chaos. Just justice being carved with the precision of a man who'd spent years trying not to remember what he was capable of. The outlaw sprawled helpless at the table, staring at him like men staring up at a ghost standing over their graves. Elias leveled his gun, not firing, only pointing, one slow sweep from Ridge to Gator to Silas to Red Jack. "You took my family," he said. "You took everything that gave my life meaning." Ridge swallowed, eyes wide with fear. We thought you were dead. You should have prayed I stayed that way." He holstered his gun with a smooth, practiced motion that sent a cold ripple through every soul watching. The sheriff finally stepped inside, hand hovering over his own weapon. "Elias," he cautioned softly, "let me handle the law from here." Elias didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on Ridge's trembling hands. "These men belong in a jail, not a grave," he said. "But they belong there today." The sheriff nodded, moving forward to cuff the outlaws. They didn't resist. Ridge whimpered. Silas stared at the floor, defeated. Gator wheezed. Red Jack muttered prayers under his breath, trembling as the strength drained out of him. The saloon fell silent. Every eye turned to Elias, not out of fear, but awe. He stood calm, breathing steady, dust swirling around his boots like desert spirits recognizing an old master. The lanterns cast golden light across his face, illuminating the lines carved by grief, the sorrow etched beneath the surface, and the steady fire still burning in those unshakable eyes. He looked less like a man and more like a story come to life, one forged in loss, reshaped in silence, and reborn in the exact moment the world needed him most. Someone whispered in the back of the room, "Crow of Coldwater Ridge." Another murmured, "He's real." And as the storm outside broke, pouring rain across the thirsty desert, the town realized they weren't looking at a ghost or a legend. They were looking at a man who had walked through fire, ash, and death, and somehow stepped out the other side still breathing, still fighting, still standing. The sheriff's voice was steady, though a tremor of disbelief still clung to the edges of it as he marched Ridgemullen and his gang out of the saloon. The outlaws stumbled, wrists bound, pride shattered, their eyes downcast like men staring into an abyss they'd carved with their own hands. Rain soaked their shoulders as thunder rumbled overhead, washing the dust and swagger off them in muddy streaks. The sheriff glanced at Elias, an unspoken gratitude flickering across his face, before turning back to the prisoners. "You boys are done," he said, and for once, Ridge didn't argue. A small crowd had gathered outside, lanterns glowing through the downpour, boots sinking into wet earth. They'd heard the commotion, the storm of justice breaking inside the Broken Lantern Saloon, and curiosity now warred with fear as they watched the four notorious outlaws dragged away like broken animals. No gunfire, no blood, just the clean, efficient justice of a man who had every reason to kill and chose instead to let the law speak. Elias stepped outside, the storm settling around him like it knew its work here was finished. His coat hung open, revealing the carved eagle on his holster, no longer hidden, no longer denied. But he moved with a quiet heaviness, as if the night had lifted something from his shoulders only to leave a hollow space behind. "Sheriff," he called softly. The sheriff paused, turning back. Elias reached into his coat. The townspeople tensed, wondering if he meant to pull his gun again, but instead he withdrew a weathered bundle wrapped in deer hide. He held it out. "You'll want these." The sheriff untied the string and unfolded the bundle. Inside lay a small pile of evidence, scraps of letters with Ridge's signature, badges stolen from marshals the gang had ambushed, burnt fragments from old crimes, including one charred piece of wood etched with a child's initials, J.C., the only remnant Elias had found after the fire. "My God," the sheriff whispered. "You kept all this?" Elias nodded. "Wasn't ready to turn it in. Not until tonight." Behind them, Mara Ellison stood under the saloon awning, rain dripping off the brim of her bonnet, tears streaking silently down her cheeks. She wasn't crying for the outlaws. She wasn't crying for Elias either. She was crying for her husband, Jacob, one of the many good men Ridge and his gang had taken. For years she'd carried her grief alone, believing justice would never come. Now, watching Ridge Mullen stumble through the mud and chains, she pressed a hand to her mouth and sobbed quietly. Elias noticed her, the sorrow on her face carving into him deeper than any blade ever could. He walked toward her, his boots sinking into the mud, rain washing the dust from his coat. Mara met his eyes, her voice fragile as feathered ash. It should have been done years ago. I know, he answered. I wasn't strong enough then. She shook her head. You were grieving. A man can't carry that kind of loss and still stand. Elias swallowed hard. For a moment, the storm seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them suspended in the quiet aftermath of vengeance and memory. I made a vow, he said. After Clara and Jonah, after I buried what was left of them, I promised I'd never draw a gun again. Promised I'd never let violence rule the rest of my days. And yet, Mara replied gently, here you stand. He glanced down at his holster, shame flickering across his features. I broke my vow tonight. I didn't want to, but I couldn't sit there while they laughed about burning my family. About killing yours. Mara stepped closer, rain beating on her lashes. Elias, some legends return when justice calls. You didn't break your vow. You honored what was left of it. He stared at her, unsure how a broken man could deserve such forgiveness, such understanding. I'm tired, Mara, he admitted. Tired in a way that settles in the bones. I know, she whispered. But you're not alone in it anymore. The storm eased into a soft drizzle. The sheriff disappeared into the jailhouse with the prisoners. The townsfolk drifted away, leaving lanterns glowing in puddles like scattered stars. Mara touched Elias's arm lightly, a gesture so simple yet grounding enough to steady the weight in his chest. Where will you go? She asked. He looked toward the open desert, where dawn slowly brightened the horizon with a pale, forgiving glow. Wherever the road leads, he said. Someplace quiet. Someplace that doesn't hold ghosts. Mara searched his face, then nodded. If you ever pass this way again, you'll find a friend. Elias offered a small, weary smile. That's a gift I won't forget. When morning broke fully, sunlight spilled across Redwater Gulch like a new beginning. It glimmered off the wet rooftops, danced across the puddles, and softened the hard lines of the town. Elias stood beside his horse, a dun mare with patient eyes, and tightened the saddle straps. He moved slower than he once had, but there was a calm in his movements, a clarity that hadn't been there before. People emerged from their homes and businesses, watching him with a mixture of reverence and disbelief. They had seen something rare, a man who walked out of legend and into flesh, a spirit rebuilt not by immortality but by grief and courage. They whispered his name, but softly, as though afraid to disturb the quiet settling over him. Mara watched from the boardwalk, her hands clasped, eyes full of a sorrow and hope woven together. Elias swung into the saddle, adjusted his hat, and looked around the town one last time. The wind carried scents of wet earth and redemption. He felt lighter, though the memories would always be part of him. Justice had been done, not just by his hand, but by the truth finally set free. He guided his horse forward. As he rode through the main street, people stepped aside in silence. It wasn't fear that moved them. It was respect. Awe. The kind reserved for men who never asked to be legends but became them because the world left them no choice. The desert opened ahead, sun climbing higher, turning the horizon gold. Elias rode toward it, his shadow stretching long behind him, fading slowly as the light grew stronger. And in the quiet that followed, a voice, old as dust, steady as time, seemed to rise from the canyons themselves. They laughed at him at that poker table, until the deadliest gun in the west stood up, and reminded them why his name is still whispered along the canyons. The words drifted like a ballad carried by the wind, wrapping softly around Redwater Gulch, an echo, a warning, and a memory. Because justice, when it finally comes, does not ride in with thunder. It walks in on worn boots, carrying silence, sorrow, and the strength to rise again.